this video, I'll be analyzing Elden Ring, which is one of my favorite games of all time, using the MDA or Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics framework. So I'll start by introducing the game and the framework itself, then we'll look at 4 different categories of mechanics, which includes combat, progression, exploration, and death mechanics, and then analyze all of them using the framework. Then I'll go into some technical insights into some of Elden Ring's mechanics, and then I'll finally wrap it up by proposing an improvement to the game. Alright, so if you don't know, Elden Ring is an open world action RPG game developed by From Software, and the game was released in 2022 and is actually the first open world Souls game they ever made, and it ended up winning over 400 Game of the Year awards. The game is mostly known for its challenging difficulty, just the amount of content in the game, and also how satisfying it is to explore the world. Elden Ring features complex combat, progression, and exploration systems, which is why I think it's such a good game to analyze using the MDA framework. So the MDA framework is basically a game design framework that breaks down a game into 3 main components. Mechanics is pretty much the overall rules of the game and what the player is able to do. Dynamics is how the player interacts with those mechanics and systems and how they adapt to them. And then aesthetics is the intended player experience, so any emotions or feelings that the player is meant to experience. So I'll jump into the combat system first and I'll look at some of the main mechanics. In Elden Ring, the player has endurance or stamina and they must manage it effectively. So this means any action they perform, whether it's attacking, dodging, sprinting, blocking, or jumping, all cost stamina. There's also a lot of weapons in the game and different weapon classes which all have unique movesets, and the player also gets invincibility frames when dodging or jumping, so for a split second they basically take no damage. The player also gets a ton of options with the spell selection in the game, as well as spirit ashes, which are basically summons that help you in combat, and your weight or equip load also affects how fast you run and roll. So how does the player interact with the mechanics themselves? Well, the player has to learn each enemy or boss's moveset and make the right decision at the right time, so you have to know when you have a window to heal or attack and when you need to dodge. The player can also dodge in any direction, so they have to master this and learn that for some attacks, it's better to dodge backwards or sideways. And lastly, the player can also use specific weapons or spells to make a boss a lot easier or exploit their weaknesses as they learn and adapt to the boss fight. For aesthetics, this game is pretty challenging and most encounters are difficult, so there is always that tension, especially during boss battles. It's also very satisfying to punish a boss by attacking when you have a window or also getting a critical hit. And probably the most important one to all Souls games is the feeling of relief that the player feels after finally defeating that boss they've been stuck on for hours. Now let's look at exploration, which is the core of Elden Ring. So for mechanics, the world is non-linear and it is a massive open world. You can ride Torrent, which is a horse, to traverse faster. There are also these things called spirit springs, which basically let you jump really high in the air while mounted, which adds a bit of verticality to the map. And the player has absolutely no guidance besides a simple map, which expands as they discover more. There are also sites of grace, which are checkpoints to fast travel between, and transporter traps, which are basically traps that will teleport you to an area way later in the game. For dynamics, the player has complete freedom over where to go and what to explore, so they can optimize their path however they want. There's also hidden areas and bosses that encourage exploration. Landmarks make the player curious, and on the way to a landmark, it's very easy to be sidetracked by a cave or NPC. And it's also possible to accidentally end up in a late game area, so skilled players might end up discovering some skips in the game. Very few games give you that same sense of discovery as Elden Ring, and since there's guidance and everything you discover is on your own, it really makes the player feel rewarded for discovering a new area that gives them an upgrade that they might need. There's also a strong feeling of awe when you're in the world just because of the scale of it, and there's an area where you take a basic elevator and end up in an underground city, which kind of blows your mind. There's also some tension and fear when you're exploring an area that you aren't familiar with, because any threat can catch you off guard. Alright, next we'll look at the progression system. In Elden Ring, weapons scale with attributes, so certain weapons will deal more damage if you upgrade dexterity, for example. Sites of Grace guide the player with these subtle golden trails that hint at where to go and progress, which you can see in the image at the bottom left. Some main bosses also drop great runes, which are basically required to progress the game, and the player also progresses by leveling up individual character stats by spending runes. So for the dynamics, the player can choose to run away from a boss giving them trouble, and explore somewhere else, get stronger, and then come back later. The player can farm runes to level up or find shortcuts to get past an area, and there's also a ton of possible builds in the game, so the player can experiment with these builds thanks to a respec mechanic which lets them reset their stats. All of these make the player feel like they have complete control over their playstyle, and they can basically create any build they want and also give them control over the difficulty of the game. It's also very satisfying to come up with a really strong build by combining different tools. There's also a feeling of growth when you return to a boss you struggled with before, but now you're so much stronger and can get past it easily. Alright, and the last mechanic I'll be looking at is the death loop in Elden Ring, which is also very important since it is a Souls game. So the core mechanics are pretty much that you lose runes when you die and you can recover them until you die again. When you die, you respawn at the last site of grace you rested at, and enemies also do respawn after death or resting. In terms of dynamics, this encourages the player to play more strategic and careful so they don't die and lose their runes. Players also learn after dying a lot, so failure definitely teaches you a lot in this game. There is also some decision making, so you need to choose if it's really worth risking your runes and moving forward, or fighting that boss, or if it's just smarter to back out for now, upgrade and then come back later. As any other game, the player feels frustration when dying, but honestly it's worse in this game because you lose your runes and you will die a lot more often. The ability to recover your runes makes you want to go back and retry, and when you finally do succeed, it feels very satisfying. Elden Ring is a very technically complex game due to the amount of systems it has, but here I have some mechanics to discuss their implementation. First, I'll start with the combat mechanics. So every character in the game has their own hitboxes for collision detection, but on top of that, every unique weapon in the game also has its own hitbox, so you can see how it can get complicated very quickly. In Elden Ring, each boss has its own finite state machine, and what this basically means is that each boss will always be in a specific state at a time, and it will change that state based on specific conditions. So we'll have an example diagram of a finite state machine on the right, and you can see that there's multiple states. So say in Elden Ring a boss is wandering around, and it's not detecting the player, it's in that wandering state, and the moment it sees the player it will change to a combat state. This can also go one step further because bosses also react and change their actions based on the player's actions. So for example, the boss will use different moves depending on the distance from the player. So some bosses will run away from you if you get too close and enter a dodge or evade state. And with the finite state machine, you can model all sorts of states and conditions you want the boss to have. For the world of Elden Ring, there's also some techniques that are used to make it feel more seamless. One of these is hidden loading screens. So for example, if you're taking an elevator to a new area, the game's going to load assets while you're in that elevator so it feels seamless instead of showing you a loading screen. There's also flags for quest lines, so say if you do one NPC's quest line, it should block another. In that case, you can use a flag and set it to false for the other NPC when you need to. And finally, Elden Ring also uses level streaming, which means the entire world is split up into chunks, which are loaded and unloaded as needed. So the player's position in the world is basically tracked at all times, and when you get really far away from an area, that area gets unloaded, and when you get closer to certain areas, they'll be loaded into the game. Now to wrap it all up, I'll discuss an improvement to Elden Ring, which is a seamless co-op system. So currently in Elden Ring, you can play co-op with friends, but it's very limited like other From Software games. How it works is basically you summon a friend to help you defeat a boss, and once that boss is defeated, your friend will be disconnected from your world. I personally believe that adding a seamless co-op mode would make the game much better, as it will provide a unique way to enjoy the experience with others, and it could potentially remove the frustrating aspect of the game because you'll have more fun dying with others than dying alone. There are mods on PC that already achieve this, but I think an official implementation would work much better and be accessible to console players as well. The implementation of this would be quite complex, but on a high level you would need to sync the world states and the progression between the clients and implement a more advanced networking system to handle the player's actions. And that concludes my MDA analysis of Elden Ring. I think it's a great example of RPG game design, and there's a reason why it was such a successful game.